The morning I found out someone had torn down my grandfather's dock, I almost drove my truck straight into a lake out of pure rage. I'm not proud of that thought, but if you've ever walked outside expecting to see something that's been part of your life for 30 years and found nothing but empty water staring back at you, then maybe you'll understand. One minute, I was carrying a cup of coffee down the shoreline like I had every Saturday for most of my adult life. The next minute, I was standing there frozen, trying to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. The dock was gone. Not damaged. Not partially collapsed. Gone. Like somebody had taken an eraser to a piece of my family's history. Now, if this had just been some floating platform I built a few years ago, maybe I would have cursed a little and started pricing lumber. But this dock wasn't that. My grandfather, Walter Hayes, built that thing back in the late 70s with borrowed tools and stubborn determination. My dad used a joke that the old man trusted that dock more than he trusted most people. Some of my earliest memories happened there. Fishing at sunrise, jumping into cold water with my cousins, watching thunderstorms roll across Silver Pine Lake while my dad sat beside me pretending he wasn't teaching me life lessons. That dock wasn't property. It was family. And now there were splintered boards floating near the shoreline like a body had washed ashore after a storm. I remember putting my coffee down on a tree stump because my hand had started shaking. The shoreline looked wrong. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud. Deep grooves. Heavy equipment. Whoever did this didn't sneak in. They rolled in like they owned the place. I followed the tracks with my eyes, and that's when I saw it. Across the cove. The new resort. 3 months earlier, the land had been mostly forest. Then developers arrived with architects, consultants, survey crews, and enough money to make everyone in town think paradise was coming. They called it Cedar Ridge Retreat. Luxury cabins, waterfront dining, private marina, exclusive experiences, the kind of place that charged $500 a night, so people from a city could pretend they were roughing it. Now sunlight bounced off giant glass windows while jet skis zipped across the lake. And standing there, looking at my missing dock and their shiny new resort, I got a feeling in my stomach I couldn't ignore. Around noon, I got my answer. A black SUV pulled into my driveway. A man stepped out wearing loafers that had never seen dirt in their entire existence. Tall guy, mid-40s, hair perfect, smile rehearsed. He walked over like we were about to discuss landscaping options. "You must be Mr. Bennett." I nodded. "I'm Kyle Mercer, Operations Director at Cedar Ridge." "Okay." He glanced toward the water. "I wanted to personally address the waterfront structure that was recently removed." Recently removed. Listen, there are a lot of ways to say someone destroyed your property. That wasn't one of them. I crossed my arms. "My dock." He smiled politely. "Yes. Unfortunately, it wasn't compatible with our updated shoreline development plan." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "The structure wasn't included in current waterfront specifications. Removal was necessary to maintain visual continuity for our guests." Visual continuity. I swear those were his exact words. I looked at this man and realized he wasn't joking. My grandfather's dock had been demolished because rich vacationers might not like looking at it. "You tore down my property because it didn't match the scenery?" His smile tightened. It was determined to be an unauthorized structure. That word hit me harder than I expected. Unauthorized. My family had owned this shoreline longer than he'd probably been alive. The dock had existed before his resort investors even knew this lake existed. And somehow we were unauthorized. I should have exploded. Honestly, I wanted to. Instead, I just stared at him. Then I asked one question. "You got paperwork proving that?" For the first time, his confidence flickered. Only for a second. Then he recovered. "Our legal department reviewed all relevant documentation." That wasn't an answer. And he knew it. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Kyle walked back to his SUV, convinced he'd handled the situation. The funny thing is, he probably thought he won. That night, I sat alone on my porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The lake looked different without the dock. Empty. Like a missing tooth you couldn't stop touching with your tongue. Around 10 o'clock, I remembered something my father had said years ago during one of those conversations you don't think matters until suddenly it does. It wasn't about the lake. It wasn't about the dock. It was about a road. A very specific road. And before I went to bed that night, I pulled an old property folder out of a dusty cabinet and started reading. By midnight, I wasn't angry anymore. I was interested, because if what I remembered was true, the people who tore down my dock had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise for the first time in weeks. Not because I couldn't sleep. Quite the opposite. I had slept better than I had the night before my wedding. Because for the first time since my dock disappeared, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what they had overlooked. The folder sat on my kitchen table exactly where I'd left it. Coffee in one hand, reading glasses in the other. I went through every page again just to make sure I wasn't letting anger invent facts. Property maps, transfer records, survey notes. Then finally, the document I was looking for. An access agreement signed nearly 6 years earlier. My father had been right. The final stretch of Timber Pass Road. The steep section climbing the ridge before reaching Cedar Ridge Retreat crossed our land. Not theirs. Ours. The developers had been granted temporary access during construction. Heavy trucks needed a route. Equipment needed a route. Everybody expected that eventually they'd negotiate a permanent easement. Apparently nobody ever finished that conversation. And somehow, after millions of dollars in development, dozens of meetings, lawyers, engineers, investors, and consultants, they forgot. I sat back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. You ever notice how people get careless when everything keeps going their way? Success creates blind spots. And these people had one the size of a mountain. 3 hours later, I was sitting inside the county records office. The woman behind the counter recognized me. "Morning, Luke." "Morning, Susan. What can I do for you?" I slid the file across the desk. "I'd like to review termination procedures for this agreement." She adjusted her glasses and started reading. The longer she read, the quieter she got. Finally, she looked up. "You sure about this?" I shrugged. "Just explore my options." Susan gave me a look. Small towns are funny. Nobody says what they're actually thinking. But everybody knows. After a few minutes, she handed me the paperwork. Everything was exactly as I'd hoped. The agreement could be terminated. Legally. Cleanly. No courtroom drama. No months of litigation. Just notice requirements and proper filing. By lunch, the paperwork was submitted. By dinner, it was official. And by then, nobody at Cedar Ridge had any idea what was coming. A week passed, then another couple of days. I didn't hear from Kyle. No lawyers. No phone calls. Nothing. Which told me they still hadn't figured it out. Then Saturday arrived. I loaded a chain into the back of my truck and drove up Timber Pass Road. The morning air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds were singing. Honestly, it was a beautiful day to ruin somebody's business model. About 100 yards from the resort entrance stood the property boundary marker. I parked, set the posts, stretched the chain, hung a sign. Private property and no access. The whole thing took less than 40 minutes. Years of assumptions ended in less than an hour. Then I waited. The first vehicle showed up 20 minutes later. Delivery truck. The driver slowed, stopped, looked at the sign, looked at me, looked back at the sign. "You serious?" "Very." He sighed, called somebody, turned around. That was the beginning. By noon, half a dozen vehicles had reached the barrier. Every single one had the same reaction. Confusion first, then frustration, then realization. By late afternoon, a resort security SUV arrived. 2 guards stepped out. One younger guy, one older guy with the exhausted expression of someone who knew exactly how bad his day was about to become. "You can't block this road." I smiled. "Actually, I can." The younger guard pointed toward the resort. "This road services Cedar Ridge." "Interesting. It has to remain open." "According to who?" That ended the conversation pretty quickly. Paperwork is a difficult thing to argue with when you don't have any. The next 3 days were fascinating. I never interfered, never taunted anybody, never celebrated. I simply watched. The resort kept operating. Technically. But everything suddenly became harder. Food deliveries got delayed. Cleaning services arrived late. Maintenance crews got lost trying to navigate old forestry roads. Guests started calling the front desk, asking why their GPS was leading them into what looked suspiciously like the set of a horror movie. Then came the reviews. At first there were only a few. Beautiful location. Terrible access. Amazing lake views. Impossible to reach. Luxury resort. Third world road conditions. I shouldn't have laughed at that last one. But I did. The following weekend, I stopped by Miller's Diner for breakfast. Now, if you want to know what's happening in a small town, don't read newspapers. Sit near retired men drinking coffee. Those guys know everything. I walked in and immediately noticed people looking at me. Not hostile, curious, like they'd heard rumors. Martha, the owner, filled my coffee cup and leaned closer. You really shut down Cedar Ridge? I shook my head. No. What do you mean no? I shut down my property. What happened after that isn't my responsibility. She laughed so hard she nearly spilled coffee. By then, the story had spread everywhere. Some people thought I was a hero. Others thought I was petty. A few thought I'd lost my mind. Personally, I didn't care. The only opinion I was interested in belonged to one specific group of people. The investors. Because investors don't panic when feelings get hurt. They panic when numbers change. And numbers were changing. Fast. About 10 days after the chain went up, I drove near the resort and noticed something new. Construction equipment. Survey crews. Engineers. Apparently, they were looking for alternative access routes. The problem was geography. The ridge on one side was too steep. The wetlands on the other side were protected. Building another road would cost a fortune. And even if they started immediately, permits alone could take months. Maybe years. For the first time, they were discovering the difference between ownership and dependence. One afternoon, I was standing near the chain when a luxury SUV pulled up. A woman climbed out wearing expensive hiking clothes that looked like they'd never seen an actual hike. She stared at the barrier, then at me, then back at the barrier. "Excuse me," she said. "Is this some kind of protest?" I couldn't help smiling. "No, ma'am." "Then what's going on?" "The resort doesn't have access." She blinked. "What do you mean they don't have access?" I pointed at the road. They were borrowing it. The expression on her face was priceless. Like somebody had just informed her that the hotel she booked didn't actually own its front door. By the second week, things got worse. A lot worse. One rainy afternoon, a supply truck attempted the alternate forest route. Halfway through, it sank axle-deep in mud. Recovery vehicles got stuck trying to pull out. The entire operation turned into a disaster. Pictures hit social media within hours. Thousands of people saw them. Investors definitely saw them. And then came the moment I knew Cedar Ridge was bleeding money. A wedding. A big one. Luxury venue. Hundreds of guests. Months of planning. The kind of event resorts dream about. Unfortunately, dreams need roads. 3 buses carrying guests arrived that Saturday morning. 3 buses that couldn't get through. People in suits. People in dresses. Grandparents. Children. Everybody standing there staring at a chain stretched across a road. Some tried walking. Some turned around. Some demanded refunds. The wedding happened eventually. Sort of. But the damage was done. By Monday morning, rumors were everywhere. Emergency meetings. Investor calls. Legal consultations. Financial projections. The machine was finally feeling pain. And that's when my phone rang. Unknown number. I already knew who it was before I answered. "Luke, Kyle Mercer." His voice sounded different. Less polished. Less confident. More human. "We need to talk." I looked out across the lake toward the empty space where my family's dock used to stand. For a moment, I remembered our first conversation. Unauthorized. Visual continuity. Removal was necessary. Funny how language changes when leverage changes. I leaned back in my chair. "What exactly do we need to talk about, Kyle?" The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me everything. Because for the first time since this whole mess started, they weren't calling to explain. They were calling to negotiate. I told Kyle we could talk the following afternoon. Not at the resort. Not at some lawyer's office. At the lake. The same place where this whole thing started. The next day I got there early. The water was calm, the kind of calm that only shows up after a storm has already done its damage. I stood near the shoreline with my hands in my pockets, looking out at the empty patch of water where my grandfather's dock used to sit. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I knew it was him. Luke. His voice was different now. Gone was the corporate confidence. Gone was the polished presentation. What stood behind me wasn't a man representing a luxury resort. It was a man carrying a problem he couldn't solve. I turned. Kyle looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Wrinkled shirt. No sunglasses. No smile. Funny how reality strips away status symbols. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. We'd like to resolve this. I've been waiting 2 weeks to hear those words. The strange thing was, I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would. Maybe because anger burns hot, but doesn't last forever. At some point, all that's left is the truth. And the truth was simple. This entire disaster never needed to happen. You mean you'd like your road back? Kyle looked away for a moment. That answer was enough. We're prepared to rebuild the dock. There it was. The first concession. Not an apology. A concession. We'll restore it completely, he continued. We'll cover all costs. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question I'd been carrying since the day my dock disappeared. Who ordered it? Kyle's jaw tightened. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, he sighed. It came from upper management. Because it was ugly? No. That surprised me. No. He shook his head. Then he said something I honestly wasn't expecting. Because one of our investors complained. I stared at him. What? Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. The dock showed up in promotional drone footage. One of the investors felt it made the shoreline appear less exclusive. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. My grandfather's dock had been erased because somebody sitting in a boardroom wanted a prettier video. All that damage. All those losses. All that chaos. Because somebody cared more about appearance than ownership. Kyle looked embarrassed, saying it out loud. He should have. I took a deep breath and looked back at the lake. Then I finally told him what I wanted. First, the dock gets rebuilt exactly as it was. Done. Same dimensions. Same location. Same design. Done. Second, I want formal recognition of my waterfront rights filed with the county. A slight hesitation. Then another nod. Done. I turned toward him completely. And third, this was the important one. The road changes. Kyle's expression told me he already knew. You want a permanent easement. Correct. We expected that. Annual access fee. That got his attention. Not because he disagreed. Because now we were talking about permanence. The kind of permanence investors understand. The kind written into budgets. Contracts. Financial reports. For several seconds, he stood there doing math in his head. Calculating losses. Future risks. Alternatives. Eventually he exhaled. All right. Just like that. No argument. No negotiation. No counteroffer. That was the moment I realized the fight was over. Because people only stop negotiating when they run out of leverage. We spent another hour discussing details. Lawyers would handle paperwork. Surveyors would verify boundaries. Engineers would oversee reconstruction. By the time we finished, everything was settled. Kyle started walking back toward his vehicle. Then he stopped, turned around, and surprised me one last time. You know, he said, when this started, I thought you were being unreasonable. I smiled. Only when this started. That actually got a laugh out of him. A tired one, but real. Then his expression became serious. We should have checked. Yeah. We should have asked. Yeah. We should have respected what was already here. That one hung in the air. Because it wasn't really about the dock anymore. It was about something bigger. History. Boundaries. Respect. The things people tend to notice only after they've crossed a line. A month later, construction crews arrived. Not demolition crews. Construction crews. And for the first time since all this began, I watched people build instead of destroy. When the dock was finally finished, I walked onto it alone just before sunset. The boards creaked beneath my boots. The water reflected gold and orange across the surface of the lake. For a second, I could almost hear my grandfather laughing. Maybe that sounds sentimental. Maybe it is. But some places hold memories so tightly that losing them feels like losing people. And getting them back feels like getting a small piece of yourself back, too. The resort survived. In case you're wondering, they didn't go bankrupt. The investors didn't abandon the project. The road agreement was signed. The fees were paid. Life moved forward. But something changed. Not just for them. For me. Because I learned something through all of this. Power isn't always visible. Sometimes the person with the biggest building has less leverage than the person with the smallest piece of land. Sometimes the strongest position in a conflict isn't money. It's knowledge. It's understanding exactly where the lines are when everybody else assumes they already know. Now here's the part that still divides people in town. Some folks think I did the right thing. They say Cedar Ridge created the problem and deserved every consequence that followed. Others think I went too far. They argue I should have accepted compensation immediately instead of shutting down access and letting the situation spiral. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. Honestly, even now I'm not completely sure. What I do know is this. The moment somebody decides your history doesn't matter because it's inconvenient to their plans, something important has already been broken. And if nobody pushes back, that kind of thinking only grows. So that's my story. A story that started with a missing dock and ended with an entire resort learning the difference between ownership and assumption. But now I want to hear from you. If someone destroyed something your family had built decades ago because it didn't fit their vision, what would you have done? Would you have taken the first settlement offer and moved on? Or would you have done exactly what I did and reminded them where the property line really was? Let me know down in the comments. Because trust me, this debate has been going on in my town ever since it happened, and I have a feeling it's about to start all over again right here.